As a sender, before even structuring the email clearly, you also have to know what you're looking to achieve. And so if you're just playing the game of like sending things because that's the job, but you're not really moving a project forward, you're bound to just send very messy communications that don't have clear asks or clear next steps. Making a distinction between informational emails where you're sharing information with people to let them know about some process, or where you're specifically asking for input or an action, those are very different things. And sometimes emails just cross the line and just get blurry, and you don't know which one it is as a writer or as a receiver.
What ends up happening a lot of times when people say like, oh, I dislike email, I dislike, it doesn't matter what platform, part of it is just not structuring the comms right. And so the idea of having an entire body of text without anything broken out, with people's names written in them, with questions written in them, like by not chunking information and by just sort of like dumping all this info on another person, of course it would be overwhelming. So you receive one of those in a day. What do? You like mark it unread, or you just like leave it and you hope someone else answers because it's too much cognitive overload. So the idea is to go through this and how to structure some of these comms, and hopefully it gives some insight into ways in which you can be more effective and concise when communicating with written materials.
I'm going to run you through composing an email. I'm going to name each of the components, and I want you to pair it back what the purpose of each of those is and how they should be used, right? All right. Sending an email to 10 people, 2 of them I need input from, and I'm also including a broader group for awareness. So I'm opening up the new email. The first thing I see is the 2-line. Do you fill it out from the start, or do you usually go back to the 2-line after?
Usually you would know like what you're sending the email about. So you're like, I know this is for, I need Miz's input and like Miz and Joey's input on this thing.
What about your CC field? Who are you in there?
Everyone who needs to have visibility on the message so that it isn't like, I didn't know this thing happened, right? An email is a little bit different than Threads or Slack, something that has like wider visibility to it. But anyone who would need to be in a closed information loop like that, but needs to have visibility, they have to be on CC.
Yeah. There's a default feature on the Mail app in iOS where it can show you the to or CC label right ahead of the subject line to let you know if you are on the to or CC line of that email. And it's really helpful for sorting emails because you know which ones are informational and which ones are actually to you, if people use it consistently and correctly, which they don't, right? Subject line sounds pretty obvious. Ideally prepended with what kind of information, what kind of email it is, and whether or not there's a due date or a response requested date. Usually good to put that there.
This is where tagging comes in, right? Tagging according to what it is, informational versus action required versus for review. Great way of setting things up.
So now we're moving into the body itself. What's your take on TLDRs? Do you like putting a summary up top? Do you do it with discretion? Okay. Every email or some?
Almost all, because it's somewhat like military communications where there's always an above the fold takeaway. A nice way of breaking down body is to do sections. So you can, and they don't need to be formal. They don't need to be repeated as far as a model goes, but it's this idea of put headings. So you might have TLDR, then you have overview, then you have, maybe there's like overview background, the same thing, overview, like 4 bullets, 3 to 5 bullets of like, what is the overview? Very concise. Next steps, or ask at the bottom, ask, please review by this date. But having these like subsections and then writing in bullets under each section just makes things so much easier when people can chunk it out. So we don't need to like respond and communicate in responses with bullet, because what you should be doing is you're responding to what those bullets are, right?
Yeah.
You're setting it up so that somebody goes, cool, good. But you want to minimize it so that there shouldn't be a lot of like deep conversation going back and forth in these things. That's where it gets inefficient.
Using bullets and separating out thoughts into discrete sentences, paragraphs, bullets also makes it way easier for the rest of the chain to follow along. because then you can quote certain sections and answer directly to them. If you have multiple ideas tied up into one sentence, it's really hard to parse out which part you're answering to. And so in the case where there is input required from multiple people on, let's say, 2 or 3 points, bulleting those out really does help quite a bit in letting the rest of the conversation flow. So you're kind of making an investment in the future there. A lot of this might sound pretty obvious, but if you look at your inbox and look at all your emails, a lot of them actually don't follow this structure. And so this is really an exercise in saying this is what it really should be. If we were all to do this correctly, think about how much better our email might be.
In the subject line, having clear title to prime people's expectations. So this is around the idea of informational, for review, action required, but priming people with like what it's about. So if it is, if it's for review and it's like operations strategy doc, April 2022, like somebody's got a pretty good idea before reading the email. If they've been sent this thing and it says for review, they're like, man, I probably like have to review some operations strategy doc. Like they don't need to think too much. The email shouldn't be like all this information. It should be like, I know I have to do this thing when I open this email. One courtesy thing in a subject line and then reiterating it in a body can be 30 minutes review, like roughly 30 minutes time. Because even then somebody can just go, cool, I'm not going to open this. I'm not going to look at it. I know the expectation is so clear that I have to do something because I'm on it like 2. It says for review and it's probably going to take me this long. It's a really nice way of setting expectations. So it's like you try to take as much work off someone else's plate as possible before they even dig in. Specify a date. I think we've loosely talked about this, but being clear about if you can respond by date X, great. If you don't have time before then, please let me know. Giving people a clear time. Or sometimes, depending on the information, is if you're just sending an informational thing and you say, if anyone has feedback before date X, great. If not, the next steps that will be taken are, so you set that expectation in advance. Like if I don't hear back from anyone by date X, this is going to Widget Company Inc. I'll send this to Widget Company Inc.
Yep, it's clear expectations. It's also helpful to note that this might be company specific. So our general rule of thumb is that 24 hours is a reasonable amount of time to assume someone has processed their email during the work week. And so you don't want to send something on a Friday night and say, I'm shipping this in 24 hours if no one sees it. That should probably wait until you trust that folks have read their email. But otherwise, assuming you don't have read receipts, that 24-hour period is the fair amount of time to say someone had time to review this, they didn't have input, and I can move forward.
So setting the reminder is key. And then the last is closing the loop is essential. And I think it's probably one of the steps that's overlooked the most, regardless of the way anyone communicates. Like if you're sending blocks of text, if you're sending anything, but it's like, we send this information into the abyss and then people go, I wonder what happened with that thing, that intro I made for that, my friend to get a role somewhere.
It shouldn't be left to imagination. The way I like to think about this, just a good kind of framework to think through, is that if someone else were to open my email for the day, they should be able to pick up where I left off. And so that might mean searching old threads from 6 months ago and being able to track exactly what happened. There's no knowledge that I have that we might share that lives elsewhere. This is the record of that communication. And so it should be complete and the file should be closed and anyone should be able to pick it up and understand exactly what happened and how it was resolved. And so that's just really good practice. It's very easy to assume that, oh, we both know that page launched because we launched it. It's obvious the page is up there. But if someone's just looking at that email thread in isolation, they should be able to follow that through from start to finish. So this is really just good stewardship across the board is the theme here. It's easy to get lazy with these tools. It's easy to assume other people know how you're using it and you kind of use it in a light way. But building the muscle and building really good habits internally, externally feels good. And it also just makes for really easy communication and clarity moving forward for everyone involved.
Totally.
All right. Big pet peeve, the forward with the thoughts ? It's always a fun one.
Oh, yeah.
And so what I'm referring to here is like there's a long thread, someone might not be on it, but you forward it to them looking for their input and you just go @Ben thoughts ? And this person gets this email. It's got a subject line. It's got forward with the subject line in it. And then there's like a long history of email to read through and piece together the context of how this actually devolved or evolved. And then try to understand the mindset of the person who was sending it to you to understand what thoughts they would actually like. Are they looking for general sentiments about how this went? Are they looking for pointers on their communication? Are they looking for input on the specific agreement that's mentioned? And so respecting the time of the receiver is really important here, and respecting just everyone involved. So the way to handle this more effectively, and this is really easy to not get right because it's so easy to forward an email, there's not a lot of friction, but taking the work to think through the person that is getting it, and make sure that you're teeing up the discussion for them in terms of what actually you would like input on. And so that might mean pulling out a specific part, quoting it, giving your opinion, and then asking for their input with a specific question that's bolded. That might be a good way to do it. Another way in our context might be to use a loom and just explain the 1 or 2 minute background on the email so that they don't have to piece it together and read the reverse chat log. This is one of the things that I really dislike about Slack, is when you get pulled into a thread, you can read through 100 replies on that thread to try and piece together how it happened in real time. And you don't get the pauses, you don't understand how many minutes pass between each of these. So you really just have to do a lot of work to piece it together. And the same is true of email. You got to go and do the work. And so take the work off of the person getting it. It's much faster for you to give the context than it is for them to gain that context.